On the night of July 31, 1999, two 17-year-old best friends named J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett climbed into a black Mazda and drove off to celebrate J.B.'s birthday. Somewhere along the way, they took a wrong turn. At 11:35 p.m., Tracie called her mother from a pay phone outside a gas station to say they were lost but had directions now, and were on their way home. They never made it. The next morning, police found their car abandoned a few blocks away. Inside the trunk were both girls, each shot once in the head. Investigators had the killer's DNA from almost the very first day. It matched no one. No name, no record, nothing in any database, and the case went cold for 2 decades. Then, in 2018, an arrest 3,000 miles away in California proved that a new kind of science could crack cases DNA databases alone never could. When Ozark police finally tried that same science on their own 20-year-old sample, the name that came back was one nobody in this case had ever considered, a name that belonged to a man half the town already knew by face. This is the story of a killer who spent 20 years hiding in plain sight, and the DNA sample that finally found him. Let's go back to where it started. And if you're new here, subscribe, we post a new case every week. The summer of 1999 was an easy one for most of the country. The economy was strong, and the same handful of pop songs played on every radio station on a loop. In Dothan, Alabama, a city of about 60,000 people near the Georgia and Florida state lines, that summer felt the way it always did, hot, slow, and safe enough that teenagers could drive around at night without their parents thinking twice about it. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were incoming seniors at Northview High School, inseparable since middle school. Tracie's father had died when she was 4. Her mother, Carol Roberts, had raised her alone since. Tracie was the one every family in the neighborhood called to babysit, and she taught Sunday school at her church. J.B. was the driven one, a cheerleader, a strong student, already talking about where she wanted to go after graduation. Wherever you found one of them, the other usually wasn't far behind. July 31st was J.B.'s 17th birthday. That night, the two girls set out for a field party in Headland, a small town about 10 miles north of Dothan. It should have taken them 20 minutes. Somewhere on the way, they got turned around, and instead of Headland, they ended up more than 20 miles in the opposite direction, in a town called Ozark. Just before midnight, their black 1993 Mazda 929 pulled into the Big Little convenience store and gas station on East Broad Street. The store had already closed, but a customer named Marilyn Merritt was still in the parking lot with her daughter. The girls asked her for directions back to the highway. Merritt gave them clear instructions and later told police that both girls seemed completely fine, clean, calm, nothing unusual about either of them. At the pay phone outside the store, Tracie called her mother. She said they'd gotten lost but had directions now. Carol Roberts would remember there was nothing wrong in her daughter's voice. The last thing Tracie said was, "Mom, I love you. Be home soon." Merritt watched the Mazda pull out of the lot and turn toward the highway, exactly the way she told them to go. It was the last time anyone saw either girl alive. The store's security camera caught one more detail that night, a small white pickup truck parked at the gas pumps at almost the same moment Tracie was on the phone. No purchase was ever logged from that pump. No one ever identified the truck. It would stay an unanswered question in the case file for the next 20 years. The next morning, August 1st, when the girls still hadn't come home, Carol Roberts called the police. Around the same time, officers in Ozark noticed a black Mazda parked on Herring Avenue, less than a mile from the pay phone, engine off, gas tank nearly empty, doors unlocked, a driver's license sitting in plain view on the dashboard. Both girls' purses were still inside, cash and cards untouched. It took hours before anyone realized the trunk could be opened without a key, from a release lever inside the car. When an investigator finally popped it, both girls were inside. Each had been shot once in the head. There were no signs of a struggle in the car itself, but the girls' clothing told a different story: mud on their shoes, briars caught in the fabric, both pant legs soaked to the knee. Wherever they had actually been killed, it wasn't Herring Avenue. The car had simply been left there afterward. Investigators also lifted an unidentified palm print from inside the trunk lid, one more piece of physical evidence that, for the next 20 years, would point to no one in particular. Robbery was ruled out immediately, nothing had been taken. Weeks later, the state crime lab confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. Semen recovered from JB's body meant this had also been a sexual assault, and whoever did it had left behind a full DNA profile. Finding a name for that DNA should have solved the case. Instead, it would take 2 more decades. A month after the murders, on September 1, 1999, a 28-year-old Ozark man named Johnny Berentine walked into the police station and said he had information. His own wife had already told investigators that he'd left home the night of the murders to buy milk and hadn't come back until 1 a.m., shaken, claiming a black truck had hit his car near Herring Avenue. Over 4 hours of questioning, Berentine gave 6 different versions of what happened that night, eventually landing on one where a tattooed stranger supposedly forced the girls to a location at gunpoint while Berentine watched, then made him drive the getaway. Police arrested him. For a moment, the town believed the case was solved. It wasn't. Berentine's story never once mentioned a sexual assault, despite the semen evidence already on file. The man he named as the shooter had a solid alibi. And when Berentine's own DNA came back, it didn't match the sample from the crime scene. By December he was out on bond. By January 2000, the charges were dropped entirely. He later admitted under oath that he'd invented the whole story chasing a $35,000 reward. Other names followed and went nowhere. A man from Michigan who couldn't account for several hours that night was flown in for questioning 3 separate times. A man from Mississippi, extradited on an unrelated drug charge after leaving Ozark just 2 days after the murders, was tested as well. Neither man's DNA matched. The white truck in the security footage was never identified. Every lead the investigation had ended the same way, at a dead end, with the DNA sample sitting exactly where it started, matching no one at all. For 2 mothers, the years that followed didn't move the way years are supposed to. Every July 31st, Carol Roberts and Cheryl Bagoon relived the same night. The pay phone, the last phone call, the car turning toward a highway their daughters never reached. The case never technically closed. Ozark's police chief at the time, Tony Spivey, would later say that of the thousands of cases he worked over his career, this was the one that stayed with him. But the technology of 1999 had limits. So did the technology of 2005 and of 2010. The DNA sample sat preserved and untouched, checked again and again against a national criminal database that only holds profiles from people who have actually been arrested or convicted. The man who left it had never been arrested for anything in his life. There was also, for years, a darker rumor running alongside the official investigation, a claim, repeated by a former Ozark auxiliary officer, that a police officer had confessed to the killings while drunk, and that the department had quietly covered it up. It circulated for over a decade, fueling true crime forums and message boards, and would eventually resurface at trial. Under oath, years later, the woman who had spread it recanted completely. "I lied," she told the court. But in the meantime, it was one more thing standing between 2 families and an answer. By 2018, the case was closing in on its 20th anniversary, and it had become one of the most talked about unsolved murders in the state's history. In April 2018, Ozark's newer police chief, Marlos Walker, watched the news of an arrest that had nothing to do with Alabama. In California, investigators had identified the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, responsible for at least 13 murders and dozens of rapes decades earlier, not through the criminal database, but through a technique called genetic genealogy. The method didn't search for a killer directly. It searched for his relatives, 3rd and 4th cousins who had never done anything wrong except mail in a DNA kit to research their own family history, and used those partial matches to build family trees, narrowing branch by branch until only one person fit every line of descent. Walker thought immediately of the file still sitting in his own department. Within a week he was on the phone with Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, the same lab that had helped identify DeAngelo, and sent them the 20-year-old sample. 5 months later, the results came back, a list of Alabama families whose DNA overlapped with the crime scene profile, built by the company's chief genetic genealogist, CCE Moore. Walker read through the list. One name stopped him, a name he recognized from his own school days. Coley McCraney. 45 years old. A long-haul truck driver. An Air Force veteran. An ordained minister who'd founded his own small ministry. A husband and father of 2, with no criminal record and no connection to the case in 20 years of investigation. He lived less than a mile from Herring Avenue, and had grown up not far from where the girls' bodies were found. Walker didn't treat McCraney as a suspect, not yet. A suspect could call a lawyer, or disappear. Instead, he invited McCraney in as someone who might be able to help. McCraney's wife, Jeanette, sat beside him and encouraged him to cooperate. She had no reason to think otherwise. McCraney agreed, and let an officer swab the inside of his cheek, unaware that the family tree Parabon had built already pointed to him before he'd even walked through the door. The results left no ambiguity. McCraney's DNA matched the 20-year-old sample recovered from J.B. Beasley's body. When confronted, McCraney denied everything, said he'd never known either girl, had never been in Ozark that night. On March 15, 2019, he was arrested and charged with capital murder and rape. The reaction in Dothan and Ozark wasn't relief so much as disbelief. This was a man neighbors described as a good father and a churchgoer, someone they'd waved to on the street for 20 years without a second thought. Not the police, not the community, not 2 decades of investigators, had ever once considered him. The case didn't reach trial until April 2023, nearly 24 years after the murders, delayed for years in part by the pandemic. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall personally led the prosecution. McCraney took the stand in his own defense, a decision that meant facing direct cross-examination with no protection. His story had changed completely since 2019. Now he said he'd met JB at a mall in Dothan months earlier, that they'd exchanged phone numbers, and that they'd arranged to meet the night of July 31st. He claimed his truck had broken down near the store, that the girls happened to run into him by chance, and that he and JB had consensual sex in his truck before the two of them drove off afterward, alive. The prosecution had little trouble taking the story apart. There were no calls, texts, or witnesses linking McCraney to JB before that night. Marilyn Merritt's account from 1999, 2 lost girls asking for directions, nothing more, never changed. Trace's 11:35 p.m. call to her mother described 2 teenagers trying to get home, not 2 teenagers on their way to a rendezvous. Prosecutors laid out a different sequence for the jury, McCraney approaching the girls' car after they left the store, forcing them to a second location, the mud and briars and soaked pant legs explained by ground they'd been forced to cross, the rape, the 2 gunshots, the drive back to Herring Avenue to leave the car and the bodies where they'd eventually be found. The most difficult testimony came from Jeanette McCraney, the same woman who had once sat beside her husband and encouraged him to give police his DNA. On the stand, she testified that he had left home the night of the murders and hadn't come back for hours he could never explain to her. On April 26, 2023, the jury found Coley McCraney guilty on all 4 counts of capital murder. The next phase of the trial decided his sentence. After hearing from both mothers, Carol Roberts described turning her family's Christmas tree into what she called an angel tree in her daughter's memory. The jury deliberated for under 15 minutes and voted 10-2 in favor of life without parole over death. In June 2023, Judge William Fillmore made it official, life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with fines and restitution. Attorney General Marshall addressed the years of rumor that had trailed the case, including the recanted police cover-up claim, calling the case one that had been surrounded by rumors, by innuendo, and allegations that are absolutely false. In the end, the DNA was the only thing in the entire 24-year case file that had never lied. Coley McCraney is serving his sentence at William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Bessemer, Alabama. He has continued to fight his conviction ever since. An appeal and a request for a new trial have both already failed, and a long-shot post-conviction petition remains pending years later. The case became one of the clearest proofs in American law enforcement that forensic genetic genealogy could do what 20 years of traditional police work could not. In the years since, the same technique has helped reopen and solve hundreds of other cold cases across the country, families who had stopped expecting a phone call, suddenly getting one. For 20 years, the answer to who killed J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett existed as a few strands of DNA in a lab, waiting for technology to catch up to it. For 20 years, the man who left it behind lived a mile from where he'd left the girls' bodies, married, raising children, leading Bible study, greeted by neighbors who had no reason to suspect him, because nothing about him ever gave them one. There's a version of this story where the case never gets solved, where a database with no match in it stays that way forever, and two mothers spend the rest of their lives without an answer. What changed? It wasn't a witness finally coming forward, or a confession. It was the decision to try a technology nobody had thought to use 20 years earlier, sent to a lab 3,000 miles away, on the strength of a case one police chief refused to let stay cold in his own memory. If there's a lesson in that, it isn't really about danger, or strangers, or wrong turns on a dark road. It's that some answers don't disappear. They wait, sometimes for 20 years, for someone to finally ask the right question. If this case affected you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below.